We come here as part of an international collaborative project of placemaking and place marking. Celeste-Marie Bernier from University of Edinburgh and me at University of California, Santa Barbara have been greatly enriched by getting to know Bill Lawson and his former colleague, Ernestine Jenkins, who in the city of Memphis were engaged in a campus community project to mark certain sites as historical monuments. Now, throughout this country, there are endless historical monuments to Confederate generals, to military leaders, to heads of state. The large buildings, the form of cities, the billboards that we see, in many ways are all testimonies to the inevitability of white supremacy and to the power of it. And where does the opposition to that get marked? Where does it get memorialized? Where do people get to see, with their feet on the ground, places of resistance, places of struggle? What Bill and Ernestine were able to do in Memphis provoked me to deepen my work with the Freedom Foundations in New Orleans and with the Alliance for California Traditional Arts in East Los Angeles to do some asset mapping of neighborhoods. And I know it influenced Celeste-Marie Bernier in the project that you're going to see on film today, which involves unveiling a plaque at a residence on 33 Gilmore Place in Edinburgh, Scotland, where Frederick Douglass spent an important, strategically important part of his life. But also, Celeste was involved in making maps of the city, so you could see the abolitionist history of Edinburgh, slender though it was, would still be marked and visible. And part of this was also because she had uncovered and was able to secure papers from the Walter O. and Linda Evans collection that totally changed people's understanding of the Douglass family. And it basically showed that Anna Douglass and Rosetta Douglass, Douglass's wife and daughter, and Harriet Bailey, Douglass's mother, played a much more important role in the creation of the oppositional Frederick Douglass than historians have acknowledged. And that finding disturbs the gender economy of abolition in the way that it's described, and it challenges an image of history being the creation of heroic males, however, even desegregated into an occasional heroic black male, and puts things back in the hands of the masses of people and the ways in which they work together. And what Celeste did with this plaque, with the map, with an exhibit at the National Museum in Scotland, was to try to bring the archives alive, to have these new findings in the archive have a physical presence in the city so that people would understand the importance of the Black freedom struggle, but especially the collaborative, collective, cross-generational, intersectional nature of that struggle. And so we see this as part of our work as scholars, part of our work as people on the planet Earth. We see that it's not enough to just write ever more eloquent or ever more indignant condemnations of other people's suffering. It's necessary to put in motion forces that will enable people to see things for themselves and to take action toward liberation. So this is what brings us here today, and we are blessed with the presence of Brown's own Rebecca Louise Carter, whose extraordinary book, Prayers for the People, is a profound rumination on place making and place marking among people in New Orleans who insist that their murdered, deceased, incarcerated criminal youth are still worth loving, still worth remembering, that they don't want to seek salvation for themselves by disowning and disavowing the most aggrieved and mistreated members of their community. And they insist on forgiving, not that you forget that somebody committed a murder, but forgiving in the sense that Sonny Patterson of the Ninth Ward in New Orleans says, I'm forgiving myself a view of myself that's not cathected to previous injuries, that enables me to live with those injuries and to move on. So this is what we're going to be presenting today. I'd like to have Bill and Celeste and Rebecca just give a short introduction of themselves and their point of entry into the project. Then we'll show the film, and then each of us will comment on it afterwards. So we're going to start with Bill Lawson, who holds the record for having been awake the most hours today and having come the most miles and having had the most airline interruptions. And we are very, very grateful that he's here. This is Bill Lawson, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy from the University of Memphis.
Well, my name is Bill Lawson, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy from the University of Memphis. I first became interested in the project and was introduced to the project when Celeste and I met in 2009. And we talked about our work on Douglass. But she gave a beautiful talk on, we met in Liverpool in 2009. And Celeste gave a talk on Frederick Douglass's painting, pictures of Frederick Douglass. And I had just written a paper on Frederick Douglass among the Romantics, and looking at Douglass's sort of aesthetics. And we talked about it. We said, well, Frederick Douglass does have this really. And when you read Douglass's work, Douglass has an aesthetic. He's really involved and really committed to the art and bringing the art into play. And so part of my work in the project has really been trying to look at Douglass both as a philosopher and what I'm calling Douglass, and I know this might upset some people, not most people here though, Douglass as a public intellectual. That Douglass, even though Douglass had the education, and if you talk about someone who's learned it, whose works impact upon people in and outside of the academy, then you have to talk about Douglass. So what I'm going to do in my brief presentation is really go a slightly different way it's about placing Douglass in the academy, particularly in an academy that just has very little regard and little respect for the Black experience. And how do you now bring people back into that experience and make that experience lively. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about Douglass briefly as a public intellectual, read three quotes from Douglass that I think sort of bring that out, and then leave it open to conversation.
Good, thank you. Celeste?
So it's such a precious gift to be here. Thank you so much, George and Bill and Rebecca and Tricia. The work, Strike for Freedom, comes out of a social justice commitment to engaging and confronting Scotland's difficult history. As an island, Ireland, England, Wales, and Scotland, we like to remember abolition. We don't like to remember the history of slavery. And so amnesia as a moral abdication of responsibility becomes a national bill of fare. The great ways in which Edinburgh as a university that's been going for 400 years has been an institution built on the bodies and souls of women, children, and men, and its buildings that are touted as tourist attractions world over are themselves sites of atrocity. Work is being done by pioneering scholars on the ground, identifying the names of individuals who are responsible for the creation of these buildings, who were bought and sold in the 400 years of human trafficking. So the idea and the inspiration for the Frederick Douglass Project was to work with Douglass's powerful social justice conviction that while education is emancipation, enlightenment is enslavement. And so this project is continuing to honor place as a site of responsibility, a site of memorial, but of social justice activism.
Terrific. So we'll hear from Rebecca in response, and Ernestine Jenkins couldn't be with us today, but she's on the film, and she says she's better on film than in person, so we'll see. So let's have the film, Strike for Freedom. This is directed by Parisa Urquhart. I will say that the book, If I Survive, has many of these papers in it, is available for purchase. This being so close to Christmas, you're going to want to think about all of your family. It's a big book, and it's cheap, and it's filled with indispensable information. So the first response is going to be from Bill Lawson.
When I was asked to come to this really great event, and so I said, well, and I asked, what did you want me to talk about? She said, well, talk about what you want to talk about. So these were open. And I was reading Blight's book, and obviously we could talk about that later on, but that's a whole different conversation about Frederick Douglass. But I was also reading John Hope Franklin, The Dilemma of the Negro Scholar. And I don't know if you know that piece. It's really a great piece. It was written, I think, in tired, 1972, I think, 1972. And he talks about the problem of being black and being a scholar in the United States, that you had to do both. You had to be a good scholar, and if you were going to work on black people or the black interests, you had to prove that they were worth working on. And so part of my thoughts about Frederick Douglass today is to sort of, again, pull Douglass's voice into the conversation, And one of the things, and I'm only going to, mine's really short, because I think these are really nice comments by Douglass about, it just shows you how Douglass lives on, how he doesn't die, That over 100, as a matter of fact, tomorrow is the 25th anniversary of his death. He died on February 20th, 1895. So this is also a very nice celebration for Douglass. The first quote I want to talk about comes from 1871. And this Douglass gave many speeches on the self-made man. And conservatives in the United States and other people have tried to use that speech to show that Douglass said, leave black people alone. In 1871, Douglass writes, while I am for making no distinctions, I am one of those who believe that whenever and wherever there's an office to be had and a white applicant equally eligible and equally available to obtain it, that while I am in favor of no distinction on the count of color, remembering the stripes, remembering the 250 years of bondage in this land through which the colored man has been dragged, remembering that 250 years he has not had right to learn to read the name of God that made him, and that every man in this land has been at the liberty to kick him and to disregard his rights. He having no rights which a white man is bound to respect. I say, in view of that history and the history of stripes and of tears and of blood for the black man tracked through this country for 200 years, I say, whenever a black man and a white man equally eligible, equally available, equally qualified for an office present themselves for that office, the black man at this juncture of our affairs should be preferred. That is my conviction. And so this is Douglass talking about affirmative action back in 1871. He moves ahead, and he does a speech. I denounce the emancipation of fraud, of stupendous fraud. In that speech, Douglass says, and I love this quote by Douglass, and I think this goes to the Black Lives Matter. Well, the nation may forget, it may shut its eyes to the past, and may frown upon any who may do otherwise. But the colored people of this country are bound to keep fresh a memory of the past, till justice shall be done to them in the present. You've got to remember those things. You've got to keep those things in mind. Finally, this one goes to the election of what's going on in our country today. Strange things have happened of late and are still happening. Some of these tend to dim the luster of the American name and chill the hopes once entertained for the cause of American liberty. He's a wiser man than I who can tell how low the moral sentiment of this republic may yet fall. When the moral sense of a nation begins to decline and the wheels of progress to roll backwards, there is no telling how low the one will fall or where the other may stop. The downward tendency already manifests has swept away many of the most important safeguards. The Supreme Court has surrendered. State sovereignty is restored. It has destroyed the Civil Rights Bill and converted the Republican Party into a party of money rather than a party of morals, a party of things rather than a party of humanity and justice. We may well ask, what's next? This is Frederick Douglass. And I chose those quotes because I think that they really sort of speak to not only do they resonate today, but they just show you how beautiful Douglass, the language is just beautiful, Douglass's language is beautiful, but they just speak to Douglass as someone who we need to sort of keep in mind as we sort of work through our studies of Douglass.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk a little bit about race and place. 5 years ago, Tricia was graciously hosted a symposium here called Katrina Plus 10. And this brought together a group of New Orleans activists to ruminate on what had happened in the 10 years since Hurricane Katrina and to make plans for the future. It was a meeting that it might seem odd to have in Providence. Nearly every participant said we could not have this meeting in New Orleans, that the philanthropists, the police, the provocateurs would come into a meeting like this and nobody would speak openly and freely. But in coming to Providence, we're able to discuss things honestly and openly. The plans made at that meeting have borne fruit in many projects of Students at the Center, Freedom Foundations, labor community networks. Things were done here that were tremendously important there precisely because they didn't happen in New Orleans. And part of Douglass's history shows that Scotland and other places, for John Brown and others, Canada, enabled a certain kind of strategic maneuvering to go on precisely because oppressed people don't control the places in which they live. I think about our work marking place. I always think of a spot above the limestone bluffs on the Mississippi River in St. Louis. There's a 630-foot stainless steel arch called the Gateway Arch, designed by Earl Saarinen. And it was erected in the early 1960s to celebrate St. Louis as the gateway to the West. Now, the gateway to the West means it was the path toward conquering Mexican land, that it was the path toward eliminating indigenous people. It was the gateway to the West because the Port of St. Louis was built around the slave trade and on cotton going up and down the river. It's a history of brutality that was presenting itself as a splendid victory for all. That arch was meant to impress everyone. It's so tall you can see it from nearly every place in the city of St. Louis, and that would symbolize a certain past. July 14th, 1963, before the arch was completed, Percy Green, an aircraft assembly line worker, and a white friend of his, Richard Daley, charged that this was being built by federal funds, but no black workers were allowed to work on it. And so in protest of that, they climbed up 310 feet, halfway up the arch, and chained themselves to it. And it took about 10 hours for them to get down. Many photographs appeared in the papers of this demonstration at the arch. From that point on, 3 generations of black St. Louisans, whenever they saw the arch, didn't think of it as the gateway to the West. They thought of it as the place where Percy pulled off his greatest trick. And he inverted the meaning of that arch for people, the opposite of what it was intended to be. There's a nondescript corner in East Memphis that Ernestine Jackson and her allies in Memphis have marked with a sign that says the People's Grocery. And this sign says that, talks about 3 men who were attacked by whites because their business was successful in defending themselves. They were arrested. The 3 were lynched. People who protested the lynching, including Ida B. Wells, were forced to leave town. Wells's printing press was destroyed. In marking this spot and other places in Memphis that have been scenes of racial atrocity, what Ernestine Jenkins and her allies were able to do was to mark in the physical presence of the ground the hidden history of Memphis, the history that Memphis doesn't want to tell about itself. There's a place in West Oakland, in California, where there's an ordinary stoplight. And next to the stoplight, there's a red and black, a yellow and black sign that says, on August 1st, 1967, this spotlight was installed as a result of a community initiative spearheaded by the Black Panther Party. And it has Emory Douglass's drawing of a Black Panther underneath that. That basically the Panthers are well known for bringing guns to the state capitol. They're well known for armed self-defense. What is not so well known are the breakfast programs, the sickle cell anemia and anti-lead poisoning campaigns, but also that one of their first actions was to prevent black kids from being run over in the street because the city refused to put a stoplight there. And this sign marks a history of collective community action, of doing for self, of solving your own problems, of pressuring the system and winning concessions. Similarly, in the 3rd Ward in Houston, along a street that used to be called Dowling, named after a Confederate general, but because of community action has been renamed Emancipation Boulevard to honor Emancipation Park, a park created by freed slaves in the decade after slavery. There's a garden, a corner garden, that is described as the Ade Carl Hampton Flower Man Garden. Aye is Ayana Ade, a midwife, anti-imperialist, freedom fighter in the neighborhood. Carl Hampton was the head of People's Party 2, a Panther-like organization. He was shot to death just a few blocks from where this garden is by the Houston police, simply set up and executed and assassinated. No charges were ever brought. And Flower Man was Cleveland Flower Man Turner, a neighborhood eccentric who cured himself of alcoholism by dreaming of a beautiful building, which he then created out of junk and toys and hair curlers and flowers, and turned his shotgun house in the 3rd Ward into a showplace. And this garden honors different parts of the community's genius. The love and ferocity of Ayana Ade, the resolute militance of Carl Hampton and the shameful erasure of him from the city and from its history, but also the art-based community making of an eccentric like Cleveland Flower Man Turner. These mark in space the same things that Celeste did in Edinburgh by making a map, by having an exhibit at the National Museum, by placing this plaque on Gilmore Place, basically marking the territory with a history that is unknown. There's a film called Buck and the Preacher with Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte. And in the beginning, it says, this movie tells a story of people whose history is as unmarked as the graves in which they're interred. And so what these place-based activities have been aimed at is attempting to mark and make visible both the crimes that have been invisible, but also the heroic resistance that is equally important. And that's it. And now we have Celeste-Marie.
I have a PowerPoint that, sorry, I'll show you some.
Yeah, so we'll get out of the way, I think, again, of this.
I think it helps a little bit for you, too.
Oh, okay, thank you so much.
All right.
Sorry. Can you hear me? Do I need to?
Oh.
Oh, thank you.
Would you like to be ready? Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all so much, and thank you for your beautiful words, and thank you for hosting the film. 33 Gilmore Place in Scotland, in Edinburgh, is famous as a street in which, as Jeff Palmer described it to me, the bloody hands of the compensation in the Caribbean reign like kings. This is a street that is famous for $1 million homes where white people were given money, as Frederick Douglass described it, the spoils of sin, for emancipating enslaved people in the Caribbean. And Jeff Palmer said to me, when he brings school kids to that street, he speaks to it of a space of memorial. Now, because we have the plaque to Douglass's life and legacy, we have a black freedom fighter in the midst of that street. And thinking of Douglass in 1846, walking down that street, knowing the people living in those homes, gives a new way of understanding what the white racist atrocity of Britain is as an empire, Scotland as a nation, and black radical heroism burrowing away to find a way out of no way. So Douglass spends 2 years of his life in Scotland when he's appointed as Scotland's anti-slavery agent, and he sees his moral, social, political, and intellectual and philosophical responsibility to educate and enlighten Scotland as to what a real emancipation and a real enlightenment based in social justice would look like. During his time in Scotland, he journeys all across the nation. And I'm not sure too much of what you know about white abolitionist-led activity. As we all know, to be anti-slavery is not to be anti-racist. And Douglass understood the paternalism and the control that was exerted over his life and words, as Bill powerfully showed us. So Douglass hired a horse, got off the beaten track of white abolitionist-approved venues, the parlours and tea parties of Glasgow and Edinburgh, and took himself from Coldstream to Aberdeen. So he spent 10 a.m., 12 noon, 2 p.m., 5 p.m., 7 p.m., 7 days a week with his horse going to all the impoverished, destitute areas of the working people of Scotland. And as one man described it to me, a man who in 150 years, Douglass still lives on in this small town as a memory, said he came with his words of kindness and empathy. We remember him. So this film was very much a collaborative venture with everyone based here that you've just heard speak to you so beautifully, and with collectives on the ground in Scotland. So the Edinburgh Caribbean Association and Sir Geoff Palmer. The film was first shown in October last year, and it was shown in the City Chambers in Edinburgh. As I've said, the reluctance, the denial, the amnesia, the erasure, the sanitization, and the cover-up of the white folks of Scotland is large and a problem. And the purpose of the film was to show it as part of other films that Parisa, a Scottish-Iranian social justice filmmaker, has made to wake Scotland up to its complicity and its collaboration in the trade. So this event was held at the City Chambers, and it was opened by the city provost with a declaration of Edinburgh's admission of its role in the slave trade. Now, the issue of reparations is being led in the vanguard of Glasgow, and Edinburgh is behindhand. So this is about beginning to get a nation and an institution and a cultural space to think about that memory. But as Bill showed us, Douglass was doing it 150 years before. In understanding Douglass as an international freedom fighter and as an anti-slavery activist working with words as weapons in different sacred sites, it's important to understand where he's speaking, who he's speaking to, and what he's saying. Some of Douglass's most famous speeches that he gave in Scotland were in places like this in Glasgow. And this is Glasgow's City Hall. When Douglass arrives from Ireland on the ferry to Anstruther, he takes the train to Glasgow in January 1846. The film shows Scotland as a beautiful sunny place. You can only imagine the rain, wind, and hail he encountered. And during that time, there was terrible mutinies in the factories with the 14-hour days. Douglass describes it as saying, "I never saw such bleeding, hollow people of humanity as I saw in Scotland." So he's speaking in a beautiful space, and this is what he says. He says, "I tell ye, people of Scotland, the slave mother, for teaching her child the word of God, is hung by her neck in Maryland till she is dead. As you in Scotland have had something to do with this slavery, I call upon you to end it." So in these spaces, Douglass is holding upper-class white Scottish people to account at the same time that he's empathizing, speaking extemporaneously in the streets of Scotland. As he faces down the Free Church of Scotland, who were the Scottish mafia in the 19th century, they were the stranglehold, bankrolling all educational institutions, and were going on their funding missions to the deep southern states, as they described it, to get, as Douglass described it, human trafficking funds from blood. Douglass was scheduled to speak in Dundee, which is in the middle of Scotland, and this is the Free Church of Scotland's bastion church, the Abbey Church. They shut their doors to him, and the tradespeople in their trades chapel opened their doors. And if you can imagine, Dundee is a very small place. This chapel is opposite. And Douglass decides to denounce and grapple with the Free Church of Scotland. And this is what he says. He says, "I wear the fighting armor here in Scotland, a land whose every river is watered by the blood of the slave and the battle for freedom. They want me to leave this nation, but I will stay and speak. And with my living human voice, I tell ye, Scotland, break every yoke and let the oppressed go free." At the same time that he denounces loud enough for the people across the street to hear his words, "Your hands are full of blood," he says the words that everyone ascribes to the day before he dies. And I think, as Bill beautifully told us, the anniversary is tomorrow, and we should share them now. "Agitate, agitate, agitate" are not the words Douglass says the day before he dies for the first time. He says them in Scotland in this chapel as a denunciation of the tyranny, of the oppression of the Free Church. As Douglass worked to get this sign on the Salisbury Crags. And I now have offers from all kinds of archaeologists to scan and use drones and technology to find out exactly where it is. So we will soon be able to tell you exactly where it was. Douglass is speaking back to the power of the Enlightenment Centre, conscious of Edinburgh as the artery and the beating heart of what is understood to be civilization over savagery. And he is exposing them for their cutthroat racism and their persecution. He goes and climbs over the Queen's Roads Works, as it is described in the 19th century. And with Jane and Eliza Wigham, he goes and builds this sign by carving it into the landscape. And so for Douglass, the question was really how to grapple with Scotland's green and sacred land, England and Jerusalem of William Blake, and put back into it the beating artery of the reality of slavery. Send back the money as an enormously long sign. And the way he's able to finish it, they start at 4 a.m, Scotland's light comes at 3 in May when he began it, is because children living destitute and starving on Arthur's Seat start to help him. And so it becomes a collective endeavor tackling the tyranny. At the bottom here, what you see here is the Queen's residence when she's in Scotland. So he's taking on the center of power of monarchical tyranny and suffering. This story we told in the film, and that's why I want to share Scotland's legacy as a whole, as a nation, and complicate the story for you, is that Douglass goes to 300 places and speaks repeatedly with his horse off the white-mandated track. This is Arbroath. This is a church in the centre of Arbroath, which is on the coastal side of Scotland. Again, another port in which ships would come. And Douglass here speaks and has this to say. He says, "I am here to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, the bleeding, perishing slave." Now, Send Back the Money was not only a place on Scotland's green and pleasant land, it was also etched in chalk on the pavements. One of the most controversial decisions that Douglass gets involved with, the same children living rough on Arthur's Seat, is they take paint and they wait till all the big Newtown mansions of Gilmore Place, all those people are asleep, and by the time they wake up in the morning, they've painted their stoops blood red. One of the other decisions they made was in Arbroath, and this is a historic picture of the train station. Most of the buildings I'm showing you are still here. This isn't the case for this one. A big sign above these arches, as Douglass said, none of us knew how it got there. "Send back the money" was etched into the train station after Douglass said those words I just said. As he said years later, he was satisfied to see that the shadow of the sign still impregnated the bricks. So Douglass is a major celebrity, and he captures the imagination of Scotland. So there's the upper class elites who are part of the white racist supremacist institution where I work, Edinburgh, and there are those who are working on the ground as freedom fighters, fighting and resisting Scotland's tyranny and its persecution. This is the English version of a Gaelic song, The Free Kirk and Her Boy Tammy. This was a song that was sung and performed on the streets from Coldstream to Aberdeen. And you'll notice right in the centre, enter Frederick Douglass, "I say, send back the money." Scotland is a nation of song as liberation, and the Highland clearances and the atrocities that happened to the families on the Highland clearances that were the source of tyranny, despotism, and scarring we still live with today in Scotland, Douglass understood, Douglass empathized with, and Douglass spoke about. This is Paisley, which is in the centre of Scotland, again, just outside Glasgow, and it's here that he tackles the Free Church. And in the film, we talk briefly about the Free Church. He really tackles a couple of people in particular. One of them is this man here, Thomas Chalmers, one of the most renowned, infamous, blood on his hands alumni of Edinburgh, and he has 1 million statues to him in Edinburgh. So thinking about statues that need to come down, this is one of the most important. And Douglass has no qualms in taking him on. And it's not an easy thing to break into the University of Edinburgh law lecture theatres. He does it. And one of the things he says to Chalmers is he says, "You would make a distinction between slaveholders and slavery. Dear sir, you are an artful dodger. Might as well make a distinction between the sin and the sinner. Now, he takes on Chalmers, and he also takes on another man here called George Lewis. In 1846, when Douglass is in Scotland, George Lewis has just been to Louisiana, working a tour from Louisiana to Georgia, taking money upon money upon money for the Free Church of Scotland. Now, Douglass very, very rarely loses his temper, and one of the moments where he does lose his temper is in the assembly rooms, the building that you saw in the film, and he decides to tackle what exactly it is that the Free Church is doing. And this is what he says. I can almost imagine I see Brother Lewis calling on the slaveholder. I can almost go down south and see him. When I was a slave, he knocks on the door, calling on my old master, Mr. Thomas Old. When Brother Lewis knocks on the door, I answer, well, my lad, is your master in? Yes, sir. He walks into the house, sees my master, and enters the room. My ear is at the keyhole the minute he sits down. My object in making this call, Mr. Old, is to see if you'll do something for the cause of religious freedom in Scotland. We have had severe struggles. Brother Lewis, I deeply empathize with your plight. I have no ready cash. I'll tell you what I'll do. I have a young slave to be sold. I'll sell him for you and give him to you for the cause of freedom. The slave is to be sold at Easton, Maryland. The morning comes. Brother Lewis, I have a son named Lewis, I think I might change his name, sits down. The Bible is given to Brother Lewis. After prayer, he partakes of the food produced by the blood of the slave and enriched by the tears. I am tied, as I was tied 20 years before. I'm on the auction block, $500 a bid, and the auctioneer says, why so slow? He's not being sold for any wrongdoing, simply to help the cause of religious freedom in Scotland. I am sold for $600. This is what it means, Scotland, to buy and sell and make money off the trade. Brother Old gives him part of the price of the bones and the blood of my ancestors and my people. And Lewis dares to stand here today in Edinburgh and talk and make light and make jokes of it. Disgorge the plunder, I tell ye, people of Scotland. So Douglass is very powerfully engaged with the reality of Scotland while consciously understanding its mythology. Unlike in Ireland, unlike in Wales, unlike in England, he's able to tap into a land whose every river has been watered by the blood of the fight for freedom's battle. All across Scotland are sculptures of this man here, James Douglass. And Douglass uses him to talk about the ways in which his own mythology is inspired by a different kind of Douglass. One of the most powerful white persecutors who made a mockery of Douglass's life was a man called A.C. Thompson. Currently, talking of sacred sites, a 10-foot Douglass bronze statue looms over a smaller statue of A.C. Thompson, who went on to become a Confederate general. Still, that statue stands. And he writes him a public letter from Scotland, and he says, when I used to see you in Maryland, I could barely look you in the face. Now, amid the green hills of Scotland, if you were to approach me now, sir, I would treat you as James Douglass treated the English. In his journeying across Scotland, he also took to battle the fact of Scotland as a nation fighting for freedom. This is the Grampian Mountains, and Douglass would have seen them on the train journey that he made to Aberdeen. And as he said, as I see the Grampian Mountains that divide East Scotland from the west, I know that the crowned heads here met in deadly conflict over slavery and freedom. I find myself, if provoked, to feel the same determination to commit deeds as bloody. This is Perth, which is right near the Grampian Mountains, and it's the city hall where Douglass spoke and where he said, Frederick Douglass is a very different man from Frederick Bailey the slave. This was indeed Perth, the ancient kingdom of Scotland, where the crowned heads fought for battle. And Douglass, speaking of that, knew of that context. Finally, in Leith, this is a port area outside of Edinburgh where all the profits of the trade of enslaved people happened, and where the blood and bones and bricks of the buildings all speak to the sugar and trade. Here Douglass spoke to working people, and interestingly, Hannah Rose Murray, who's doing beautiful research, has found a sign of a boarding house from 1852 that says, "All welcome, brackets, except those who trade in slavery and are part of the Free Church of Scotland." This is not a sign you'd have seen in Edinburgh proper. In this space, we have the beautiful memory of a working man struggling to make ends meet. And it's recorded in an interview. And what he says is, "On Monday night, my jock, my friend, got me to go down and hear Frederick Douglass. That chiel is a Gaelic word meaning ancient hero. That chiel Douglass, I'd come, but I had not my specs. But from the look of him, I wouldn't mess with him intellectually or physically." In Ayr, Douglass spoke the sight of Robbie Burns, who was a great source of inspiration for Douglass. Douglass had, again, the selective memory of not understanding Burns, the overseer about to go to the Caribbean and be part of the enslaved trade, but Burns, the liberator of Scottish people. And we spoke in the film, and this is where I want to end, about the sacrifice of the family and the political urgency in the Black Lives Matter era that we're in an era in which Donald Trump can put Frederick Douglass on a bus and forget everybody else as part of the ancestral freedom movement, that here, Douglass, in this very church here, got the news of the death of his youngest daughter, Annie Douglass. Annie Douglass sat on the knee of John Brown when he was building his subterranean pathway to liberation. He used her bricks to map out his way of getting enslaved people out of Harper's Ferry. If we didn't have the undigitized records that Ayr keeps, all we would know is the last line of this burial record, that Annie Douglass died 10 years, 11 months, and 21 days of congestion of the brain. The Douglass sons carried this monument to their sister up the hill of Mount Vernon to do justice to her legacy and to the fact that, as they knew, their grandmother, as Douglass described it, was confined only to this line of a ledger, Harriet, daughter of Betts, born February 28th, with no grave marker. As Douglass described it, she was born with no stone or stake to preserve her memory. Annie Douglass dies while Douglass is in Scotland, and we didn't know what had happened or when he got the news. One of my brilliant students, Nick Batho, found an undigitized newspaper report by a Scottish journalist, white Scottish journalist, saying there were 2,000 in this church, people craning outside. We saw Frederick Douglass get up, stand up, spark to speak to us, and break down. We saw him do it 20 times. The liberation movement of the family is essential to understand how Douglass was able to be in Scotland. Sir Geoff Palmer, very much at the heart of this project, has been working with this monument here. He's known in Scottish elitist, white, upper-class memory as the great builder of Scotland, but he's known by the working people of Scotland as the great tyrant and dictator. This monument was built and was there 20 years old when Douglass comes into Scotland, and it's of a man called Henry Dundas. Now, no mistaking that, as you see in the distance, Salisbury Crags. So Douglass was consciously speaking back to the power of this monument. This monument was built by his workers, many of whom died making it. It's of enormous height over the city. And he was the individual who was Secretary of State when William Wilberforce, already too late, already too conciliatory, had finally decided to pass the Abolition Act in 1792. Henry Dundas told William Wilberforce, "You need to enter the word gradual." As a result, 15 years go by, emancipation happens in 1807. In that time, 630,000 people have lived and died in slavery. And this is the plaque, and still no change. Walter Evans made it possible for us to tell this story in Scotland. We built a number of resources. We've been working with Scottish schools to change national curriculum. We have an enormous online educational resource that's going live in the next month. We also have this website that George referred to with the maps and the digital maps, and I've been doing walking tours of the city. If you come to Scotland, I'll gratefully take you. But we also have these digital maps that will live forever. But we also got a permanent exhibition into the state capitol building in Maryland. We worked with campaigners there to ensure that these monuments and memorials to Black history remain sacredly in place as a permanent exhibition. And the lady on the left here is a woman called Vera Hall, who was the first delegate of color to the building, working in social justice missions. And when this exhibition was opened last year, she came with the Douglass Honor Society and with Walter and showed her beautiful quilts, which she uses as educational tools and as sources of revolution. This is the amazing team, Chris Haley, Maya Davis, and Emily Squires, that meant it was possible in the Trump era to get this as a permanent exhibition. It was not easy. Understanding how this story tells and how it translates has been at the heart of it. This is the Douglass House in Anacostia in DC, where we also told the story of the family. It was also in the National Gallery of Art in DC and in Rochester, the traveling community story of the family. And this was absolutely integral to the project. As a result of the work that we did on the Anna Murray Frederick Douglass family, the Walter Evans collection has 80 writings by the family. Over the last 20 years, I've found over 1,000. And so that's part of the ongoing legacy, is to make live again the social justice activism of the collaborative, collective family. As Anna Murray Douglass said in words that are repeatedly ascribed to her husband, "Why not I endure hardship that my race may be free?" Thank you.
So we're fortunate to have a commentary from Professor Rebecca Louise Carter, author of this indispensable book, Prayers for the People, which is a profound rumination on race, place, mourning, and living.
So I have a couple of slides. I'm just going to see if they're queued up here. So thank you very much. Thank you, George, Bill, Celeste, and Tricia, for including me in this event. I'm really honored to be here and in such great company, and grateful for the opportunity to think through this collaborative work of freedom fighting, which pushes forward my own scholarship. So I've structured my comments in 3 brief steps. In the first, I reflect on what I found helpful and also moving from the materials I was privileged to engage with, which included the film that we just saw, Strike for Freedom, but also the introduction to the forthcoming special issue of Calfu, titled Workers plus Warriors, Black Acts and Arts of Radicalism, Revolution, and Resistance, Past, Present, and Future, from which I will pull an occasional quote. Next, I bring these reflections to bear on my own life and work in New Orleans as a way to align myself more closely with this collaborative project, while also providing another example of what is possible in the expanded and interconnected geography of the Black freedom struggle. And I conclude with some brief thoughts about the work ahead, focused in particular on the transformative power of art and other creative practices, and the necessary foregrounding and integration of familial, social, and intellectual forms of kinship and relatedness. So I was given access to the materials that frame this event, the film, the introduction to the special journal issue, shortly before the winter break. It was perfect timing, just as I was traveling to Virginia to spend time with my family, who are based now in Charlottesville. There, the enshrinement of white supremacy is hard to ignore. The enduring effects of slavery, unwilling to die, are found quite literally at every turn. It is a landscape that remains difficult to traverse, requiring a constant reckoning with the social and spatial determinations of humanity and value for self and other. But the film and other materials reassured me of a continued and collaborative strike for freedom, in particular through the development of oppositional forms of placemaking and place marking. As we saw in the film and heard in the discussion, this takes place in a number of ways, including memory, history, testimony, and creative practice to reinscribe the landscape, turning segregation into congregation, to borrow from Professor Lipsitz's words in How Racism Takes Place. Quote, to transform divisiveness into solidarity, to change dehumanization into rehumanization, end quote. I have thought a lot about congregation in particular, for it points to a necessary relatedness, to kinship in and through place, as the essential grounding for a continued strike for freedom, be it the relatedness of family for Frederick Douglass or for me in Charlottesville, or be it the intellectual and scholarly forms of kinship and collaboration that bring us together in this place this evening. To map these connections is also about understanding the interconnected threads of the freedom struggle, the footsteps that those before us took, the routes we now take, and the new constructs and practices of relatedness we develop. I'm reminded here of the work of British anthropologist Tim Ingold, who understands places not as fixed locales, but as processes of convergence, with pathways along which life is led, entangled as threads in a knot or node. These nodes then connect in a dense configuration that Ingold calls the meshwork, which for me is better imagined as a quilt. The various pieces ripped and then repaired, stitched together to reveal the overall design and direction of the strike for freedom. Such work makes legible the pathways of both enslavement and cultural survival, as articulated in the film, quote, lives lost in the freedom struggle and lives gained in resistance, rebellion, and revolution, end quote. And it is this reassembling of heretofore scattered fragments that works to fill the gaps in the archives of Black history as it also directs Black futures. This is critical work since African American communities within a white racist imaginary have been systematically deprived of conventional platforms for articulating their histories of struggle and survival. The statement of purpose from the introduction to the special issue of Calfu sums up the task and the tools at hand. Quote, we bring together an array of interdisciplinary international scholars who are all working across the fields of Black studies, African diasporic studies, slavery studies, American studies, and memory studies, as they debate, destabilize, interrogate, and recreate existing methodologies within literary studies, memory studies, art history, visual culture, history, intellectual history, politics, sociology, and material and print cultures, in order to do justice to the hidden histories, untold narratives, and buried memories of African diasporic freedom struggles over the centuries, end quote. Again, what emerged for me to anchor this work and the strike for freedom more broadly are the multiple dimensions of relatedness, from private to public spheres. And I was struck by how kinship fundamentally grounds and directs this work, bringing an important sense of humanity and thus opportunity to the more formalized representations and scholarly tracings of freedom struggles with which we are more familiar. For example, I learned a lot from the materials and the film in particular about Frederick Douglass as a person fully embedded in an extended family system with the fight for freedom housed simultaneously and perhaps even primarily through the heroism and activism of his mother, Harriet Bailey, his wife, Anna Murray, and their children. And it is through the speeches, essays, letters, photographs, mappings, dwellings, and other materials produced by, inhabited by, or otherwise representative of the Douglass family that it becomes possible to do justice to the realities of Black lives, iconic and unknown, as lived during slavery and in its afterlife. To identify and mark these sites of congregation, as with the exhibition in Edinburgh or the installation and unveiling of the Frederick Douglass plaque at 33 Gilmore Place, is thus powerful in its intimacy, and it gives us a critical opening. As we come to know Douglass beyond the representative self-made man as a fallible, mortal individual, we move closer to his humanity and thus closer to our own, understanding the meshworks of relatedness in which we are also embedded. The inquiry and the broader strike for freedom might thus proceed in ways that allow us to also be at home, connected and complete, even as we are out in the archives, the academy, and the world. With that, let me take you very briefly to my home in New Orleans, which has also been the site of my research in anthropology and urban studies since 2005. My work focuses on the religious beliefs and practices of African Americans in New Orleans who mourn and memorialize the dead, primarily the young Black men who are most frequently the victims of homicide. Identifying a larger system of social death and erasure, particularly well illuminated in the decades since Hurricane Katrina, I document how residents develop distinct practices of kinship and relatedness to assert Black social membership and value. With the Black Baptist Church in the Central City neighborhood as a primary site, a church that I call Liberty Street Baptist Church, I follow the anti-violence ministries of clergy and parishioners, from public demonstrations and vigils to more intimate support groups for mothers who have lost children to violence. I trace more broadly the active remaking of a nonviolent, beloved, and just urban society. The practices I observe there really resonate with what we've seen and discussed this evening, as oppositional forms of placemaking and place marking build upon and further the strike for freedom. To give you a more ethnographic example, I will quickly trace a particular ministry that was started by the pastor at Liberty Street. Pastor Samuel became the spiritual leader of the church in the late 1980s, continuing several key ministries, including a campaign against the violence that was impacting the community. After a particularly difficult period in the mid-1990s, the pastor decided to rent a commercial billboard at a very prominent intersection where he put up a sign that read, "Thou shalt not kill." It was a simple but arresting message, rendered in dark capital letters set against a plain white background. There were no other words or images, not even the name of the church. The idea, according to the pastor, was not just to communicate the message that killing was wrong, but to make a statement within the community that, and beyond, that it is God who says it is wrong. The church maintained the billboard for 3 years until the advertising company abruptly canceled their contract after the church had been late with a lease payment just one time. Without a word, the church's account was closed and the sign was returned to its corporate advertising origins. Undeterred, the church continued its ministry on a smaller but ultimately broader scale. Pastor Samuel printed thousands of placard-sized signs with the same message and in the same bold design, and church members placed them up all over town, leaving signs with residents and business owners, tacking them up on bulletin boards and telephone poles, and staking them in the neutral ground, the median that runs down the center of many of the city's major streets. Soon they were visible at almost every turn. That is, until the City Department of Sanitation swept through and removed them all. It was a source of much frustration for the pastor. I was going all the way down that neutral ground, putting those signs along the street, maybe 20 in a block on each side, he said. And the city came through and took every sign down, took every sign and threw them away. And they were expensive, too. So I said, I'll tell you what, we'll be the signs. Thus began a series of weekly demonstrations. Church members would congregate outside, sometimes holding hands or positioning themselves shoulder to shoulder with each person holding a "Thou shalt not kill" sign, to form a protective barrier around a particular part of the neighborhood, such as the site of a crime or a distressed area in need of care. Their bodies literally became the signpost for the assertion of Black social and spiritual value, commanded from on high and made visible on the ground. The commitment to this action was impressive. Church members returned each week to place themselves on the front lines of their community, defining a physical and symbolic zone of safety and thus freedom. And the impact was also great, exemplified by a memorable encounter that Pastor Samuel had and liked to recount. There was this Black guy. I could see him coming almost all the way from the other end of the block, he started. He walked right down the middle of that neutral ground, all the way down to Claiborne, came right up to me, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "This is the safest I have ever felt in my life." I'll never forget that. He said, "This is the safest I have ever felt in my life." And every one of our members just stood there. They just stood there holding those signs, and it was just awesome. This example, among many others, sheds light on several aspects of placemaking and place marking at work in the critical shift from segregation to congregation, divisiveness to solidarity, and dehumanization into rehumanization. It foregrounds especially the forms of relatedness to which I continue to return and on which these processes depend, the recognition, embodiment, and cultivation of family, here in religious, secular, and also spatial terms. It also makes clear the inventive practices and tactics the people themselves developed to command and create in and beyond the specificities of place, the conditions in which they might freely exist and move. The man who walked down the center of the neutral ground makes this clear, articulating a sense of belonging and safety in an otherwise hazardous urban landscape. In closing, I would like to share just a few thoughts about how we might continue this work. And again, I am inspired by the forthcoming issue of Calfu, which directs us first through the reassembling of the private and public life of Douglass and other freedom fighters. Second, to the integration of creative practice, particularly the transformative and insurgent possibilities of art and art making across the Black Atlantic. Third, to the tracing of the strategies of survival, subterfuge, endurance, and resistance developed within African American communities. And fourth, to the foregrounding of acts of witnessing and testimony in remembering, rehabilitating, and preserving the legacy of Black lives. This is indeed inspirational, but I especially enjoyed what Professor Lipsitz said at the end of the film, quote, "The cause of freedom is supported by the aspirations and activities of freedom-loving people all over the world. We're following in the footsteps of ancestors, and we like to think that the footprints of the ancestors aren't always visible, but if you walk in their path, they'll appear. And ideas and inspirations will come to you that can enable you to continue the freedom struggle for today and for the future." And this helped to put into perspective an encounter that closed my holiday visit with my family in Virginia. It was actually my mother's great idea to make the hour-long trip to Richmond to see the Kehinde Wiley statue, the culminating piece in a series of artworks titled Rumors of War. Wiley's monumental equestrian statue was first unveiled in New York City's Times Square in late September 2019, but it was moved to its permanent home in Richmond, unveiled in mid-December in front of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. The work was created in response to the Confederate statues that continue to enshrine white supremacy throughout Richmond, in Virginia, and around the nation, despite persistent calls for their removal. Here, Wiley features a young African-American male subject dressed in urban streetwear. The broader intent, in Wiley's own words, is, quote, "to use the language of equestrian portraiture to both embrace and subsume the fetishization of state violence," end quote. Seeing the statue was important, a monumental example of the transformative power of art aligned with the act of oppositional placemaking and place marking. But what really made this experience resonate for me was the familial and social relatedness through which it took place. So my cousin, Hermine Penson, who is professor of English at William and Mary, met us there. She arranged to have her friend Valerie meet us also. It turned out this was Valerie Castle Oliver, the curator of modern and contemporary art at the VMFA, who gave us a wonderful tour, accompanied by her young son, who was introduced to mine. And so the gathering represented for me the ways in which we might continue the strike for freedom through relatedness brokered by creative and collective inquiry and action. As we were standing there, just after we took this photo, an elderly man approached the statue with a younger man who might have been his son. He stopped transfixed, and this look came over his face. "It's beautiful," he said out loud. I turned to Valerie to see if she had heard. "I know," she said. "That's why I love this work." So thank you, and I'm really grateful to the panelists for sharing their work with me and with all of us.